Today I'll be sharing with you about our integrator's perspective on how to ensure safety on the electrical companies, electrical grid companies, and or power generation companies, and we'll share some practical experience we have accumulated throughout working in this field. Very briefly, ICL System Technologies is our company. We are part of the ICL group of companies, and this year we are celebrating 28 years since the foundation of our company. In ICL System Technologies, we have the Competence Center for Industrial Control Systems and the Central of Monitoring, the CERN Center, specifically for ICS. We are the partner, specialized partner for industrial cybersecurity, and we have been working with Kaspersky Lab since the very beginning of their product line. Today, I want to share with you very briefly about how the power generation companies look like in terms of the Russian legislation, effective legislation, and in generally how are they being regulated. I will tell you today about what kinds of development is expected to be in this business line, and we'll also communicate our experience in helping companies in this field and how to protect this industry. We have three focus areas, and number one would be power generation. Our complex is the critical infrastructure. And if we compare for example, Russian legislation with like power supply companies, with banks, with other businesses, we can identify the main lines of business which are regulated by the federal legislation 187. We are only considering here some of these industries. We also have some documents, regulating documents, and the documents of the technical regulator of the industry. And the most regulated is the power generation and electrical supply. And the federal law is 107, specifies that the most regulation criteria are being applied to the power generation and electricity supply companies, because electricity supplies facilities and companies may be heavily impacted by a cyber attack, and we cannot give up energy. Energy affects all of our lives, and the energy is a very critically important aspect of our lives. So if we move away from the legislative standpoint, but try to explain what are these electrical facilities, the key thing to all of these electricity supply companies is their locations. We cannot just take all the substations or the critical facilities together in one location and protect them in that location. It's a given that these facilities are everywhere. They're all over the country, in your backyard, and around our city, between the cities, and it's just a given situation that we have to work with. And given the distances between these facilities, you cannot simply service and protect them without some remote control and remote supervision. And if we will take a look at how the power supply complex looks like, in addition to office system, we have a lot of different types of system, including the technological systems. We have to deal with various communication channels, which are intertwined even at one facility. Sometimes they're backing up systems, and it's a nightmare for an integrator who has to protect these kind of facilities and companies. And in this part of my presentation, the main idea is that the power supply companies, and we as an integrator consider them to be very complex, very difficult to work with facilities. It's It's really something that the attackers are looking at if they want to destabilize a situation, and potentially they can disrupt this power supply generation and power supply, companies. Simply by the very fact of these facilities existing, they are vulnerable to the attack. Moving on to the second part of my presentation, I would like to share of what we do, what we've had, what we have, and what we'll be having in the power supply industry in Russia in terms of providing safety and security. Speaking about the power supply complex or industry, it's developing. The latest trends which can be identified would be digitalization leading to various improvements, acceleration of work, improvements of automated function and manageability. Again, the next trend will be standardization and unification out of all the industries. These principles are most applicable, and they simply show us a very good result in terms of how it impacts our industry altogether. Speaking about information safety and security, it's also progressing. You can call it a certain evolution at the very beginning stage when people first began to speak about the security of technological systems. I would just identify this point in time. Let's say it's an government order number 31. Usually, the approach has been such as to wait and see what will happen, what will start requiring us, because this order number 31 had been simply mandatory, then it was not mandatory any longer. We've been waiting and waiting for new or decisions which could not be applied immediately. We tried to understand what government is expecting of us. And when they begin to speak about the federal law 187, we made a certain leap forward when the major developers and now basically everyone on the market are saying that there is a certain safety level which is built into the system. I mean, the bigger developers, along with the facility, they are providing certain safety and security from the developer. I mean, in-house antiviruses, in-house developed monitoring tools and backing up copying tools. But by in-house, I mean that this is not quite an in-house when you begin to try to look into these, like how did you develop your solution? Some recommendations are let's limit everything. Let's breach these gaps by organizational measures, and now more and more at different conferences, and we are seeing this working with our clients. The safety, built-in safety from a developer is not okay with everyone. We are speaking about some integrated approach which has to take into account the need to manage all these zoo, protection devices and measures. We have to be very flexible in our reaction and to stay in line with the government regulation. The developer, when they're providing the tools, they do not take into account everything. So summing up, I can say that there is a trend, there is a tendency that this target, that there is a goal that the industry is moving towards. Everybody comes to understanding that it's not quite right at the different facilities to introduce the same solutions. People want to say, okay, this is a highly critical facility, this is a low critical facility, so we have to evaluate risks and to implement solutions commensurate with the potential damage. Everybody, of course, wants to have a single architecture, unified architecture. And by the way, customers do not want to be attached to the developers and to the protection measures. They want to be able to develop the developer of the protection measures and devices without globally changing the whole architecture. And probably this is the future, which has already happened today in certain fields, in certain areas of the banking industry. Banks are living amid constant cyber attacks, and probably the power generation industry is also will be in this situation in the future, where we will be surrounded by digital technologies, and therefore all the trends of the development of this industry will finally catch up with the real venues and facilities. And part number 3 would be the routine of how this is happening. We are helping to our customers and how the customers are helping us to evolve and develop. And let's begin by saying what we would like to see as a part of developing this industry. We want to understand better what are the facilities we are working with today. Not in the future, but today. We want to classify these facilities and to build architecture for them specifically, and to implement at least some components which may be implemented in reality. This would be the starting point when we first began moving in this direction. Next would be the building of those facilities. Let's say, for example, that we are not considering the information protection project as something separate, because it's very rarely happens that people gather together and say, okay, let's spend some money to build some protection devices and systems. According to the Russian legislation, you have the building projects and draft, and there's a bunch of stakeholders, and we as an integrator have to hear everyone, because we're only one part of this construction project. So our picture or view is quite interesting. Just to give you a substation, they're being designed turnkey, all at once, all the sections of these power substations. But as for the total picture of what they should look like and who is doing what, people do not have this big picture. We've seen it. People are lacking understanding of who is responsible for what in the adjacent industries. Everybody's doing their piece turnkey, but when you begin to dig deeper into that, when you begin to ask questions like, how is this going to work with these people just throwing their hands up in the air and they say, oh, it's not us, it's a general contractor, and the general contractor is referring to their own, designers and saying, oh, okay, they should know better. And we, as an integrator, have decided to assume the role of integrating all of that, having the situation of what we have to work in it. And we have built an approach and a certain roadmap of how we should be moving in the future to make sure that on a stage of design we could implement these solutions, which also could be scalable for other facilities and venues, which will be many in the years to come. So we have to, in a very consecutive way, to implement all the specifications in terms of reference, because to protect a power substation separately from everything else would be wrong, and this is not a protection per se. So the goal is to implement a range of components on the venue, outside of the perimeter of the venue, but to make sure that this bunch of components would be scaled up to connect in a modular way different facilities of the same type facilities, and the goal is to build standardized requirements and standards for building new facilities. And the task of this project is to make sure that we have the standardized safety procedures on the standard project or facility. And given, like, in view of the substations being built, it's a built-in functionality, and thanks to the modern systems, we can do that. It's a substations, it's Russian manufacturers, and finally they are communicating with systems of protection developers, and they are allowing these developers to install in the substations those backing up systems and protection systems which the customer wants, which would be impossible several years ago.
The next component, you can see them in white at the level of branches, the Information Security Department. It's already with all the necessary means to interact with the whole system of information security that will be deployed at the site of our customer. Everything that you see in white, this is what is realized in full. The part that is in orange or red is realized to plug in this facility. So we are finalizing testing to be able to add other facilities will be added to it later. So we also develop the documents that take into account the specificity of the site. And we hope that further down the road we have more projects with our customer using the similar principle, and we'll be able to apply it with other customers. And one more thing, this is the final slide. Our experience, 2 years in this area, will help us to develop a scheme of developing facilities of our customer. And if before the term of implementation was quite long because it was difficult to integrate different parts, so now we have typical developments, so we think it's going to be much faster to do new projects. We will avoid unnecessary issues. So in general, we hope our experience can be applied in other sites, other facilities. So if you have questions, I'm ready to answer them.